Now, a couple of years ago, I remember reading an article by scientist Adam Frank in which he called our age the age of denial. The argument goes that it's politically effective and socially acceptable to deny scientific fact. Now, you see this around more and more these days, and one of the most obvious examples of this is denial of climate change and how it has gained political traction globally and, of course, here in Australia. Now, we often think of this as an essentially irrational action by a person refusing to accept an empirically verifiable reality. But my next guest argues that behind this seemingly irrational position, there is a clear rationale. And Professor Stefan Lewandowsky is a cognitive scientist at the University of Bristol, whose research focuses on people's memory and decision-making, and also how there are cognitive and motivational factors, I suppose, that underlie some people's denial of climate change. Professor Stefan, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, your interest is in people's cognitive, the kind of cognitive factors that inspire people's decisions about climate change and how they kind of that leads them to denialism. What inspired you to start looking at this specifically?
Well, that's an interesting question. I actually became interested in this because my research 15, 16 years ago focused on skepticism in the context of the Iraq War of 2003. And what I found at the time was that those people who were skeptical of the official reason for the war, namely that it was about weapons of mass destruction, people who were skeptical of that were better able to differentiate between information that was true and information that was initially presented as true but was then corrected. So I walked away from that research, which we published in around 2005, with a very positive, warm glow about the benefits of skepticism. And then a few years later, the Copenhagen Climate Conference came along, and in the lead up to that, there was this intense outbreak of so-called skepticism about climate science in the media and on the internet and various other places. So I became interested in that because I thought, I wonder what's going on here. Skepticism is such a good thing. Maybe these skeptics are onto something. And then when I started looking at what these so-called skeptics were doing, it became apparent very quickly that this was not skepticism, but it was denial. It was simply a, concerted effort to deny or undermine the overwhelming scientific evidence about climate change. And that's how I got started in this whole project. And I now have a fairly good understanding of how denial functions and why people engage in that.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about that then, based on your observations as a cognitive scientist? So this is a study of how people behave. They're the kind of cognitive behavior, I suppose. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the first thing I can tell you is that the number one variable that is driving attitudes towards climate science is people's worldview. And by that I mean people's very deeply held belief about how the world should operate. And in particular, I find in my research, and many other people have found this in countless studies, that the more people are endorsing the concept of a free market and free enterprise without any regulation, the more likely they are to reject the evidence from climate science. And the relationship, the association between these two variables is just phenomenally strong. It all boils down to whether or not you can tolerate regulation or interference with the free market. And if that is something you can't tolerate because you find it emotionally challenging to your worldview, then chances are that you will deny the evidence from climate science, because if we take climate change seriously, as we should, then we will have to interfere with business as usual. We're going to have to put a price on carbon. We may have to introduce a tax. regulations, we may need to change our own behaviors, and that is extremely challenging.
Right.
And people sometimes resort to denial when they're challenged like that.
So to sort of go back to your initial point and the reason you took up this work to begin with, what was it seems to me you were interested in the idea of doubt, and doubt, of course, is crucial to how human beings have evolved. From Cartesian times until today. Doubt is what allows us to explore things and ask the difficult questions. But then we get to a point today, if I'm understanding you correctly, where we are too scared to do that, precisely because we want to preserve or maintain some sort of status quo.
Absolutely. And I think one of the really important things to realize in this is that science is based on doubt and on skepticism. And that it is the scientists who are the climate skeptics, myself included, because what we do is we subject our ideas to peer review before they get published. And we continue to challenge each other's ideas after publication of articles. So the scientific endeavor is based on doubt, on skepticism, cross-checking, long-term error correction, and that is how we make scientific progress. Now, denial differs from skepticism, because it is selective in what it is doubting and what it is believing. And so, for example, in my view, so-called climate skeptics are actually incredibly gullible people, because while they will doubt any well-established physics that we've known for 150 years, such as the greenhouse effect, at the same time, they're quite happy to believe that scientists are conspiring the world over to create the world government or something like that, which is standard content on denialist blogs and on Twitter. Now, to my mind, that reflects not skepticism, but gullibility. The thought that geophysicists would go around creating a big hoax called climate change, just God knows why, for the world government, or to line their own pockets with non-existent funding, that just beggars belief, I think, and reflects strong gullibility, at least at first glance.
Now, we talk about denial here. What about when we talk about denialism? Is that the sort of is that when denial becomes a political position?
Well, I think denial usually has a political origin. It doesn't have to always, but it usually does. And it's certainly in the case of climate change, the origin is entirely political because of the threat to people's worldview that I already mentioned. And I think it is very important to look at denial not just from a scientific point of view, but also from a political point of view. Because the moment you do that, denial reveals itself to be a very effective political operation. And if you look at the world today, where we have climate deniers in, lots of government positions in the United States and perhaps also in Australia, the success of denial is undeniable. They have been able to delay policy action for several decades. Now, of course, all that does is to make the action harder in the future, because we have to work even harder to get the problem under control. But, as a political movement, denial is extremely effective. And for that reason, I would argue, entirely rational.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So it becomes driven by obviously a political kind of disposition, and it has its aims and sort of aspirations in mind. Now, I've read somewhere that when the term climate change came into our vocabulary back in the late 80s, in the United States, there was about something like 65% of Americans who understood climate change to be a potential problem, at least, and that a quarter of a century later, this is decreased. So there are more skeptics or more deniers of climate change.
Well, that's it's a little more nuanced than that. I think you're right in that, 20 or 25 years ago, the public in America was already reasonably well informed about climate change. It is also true that there might have been a decline in that acceptance sometime during the last 10 years. However, the most recent data from the last couple of months that I've seen about American public opinion, those data show fairly clearly that people's acceptance of climate change is increasing and is now surpassing what it was 10 or 20 years ago. So I think people have become more educated about this and more aware of it. And what we see instead, I think, is a divergence between public opinion on the one hand and U.S. government policy on that issue on the other hand. And, of course, that's no isolated case. I think a lot of the things that the Trump administration is doing at the moment runs counter to public opinion, at least if you can trust the opinion polls.
Yes,
so climate change is one of those, but by far, by no means the only one.
Fascinating food for thought there, Professor Stefan Lewandowsky. Thanks so much for your time. We could talk far more about this. I'll just finish up with one question. Where does this work take you now? What's the next sort of stage in your research?
Well, I think the next stage, or the stage that I've been working on all along, is to draw insights from that and decide how to move forward. And that's where things get to be very nuanced and tricky because, different messages work for different people. But what my research has shown over and over again is that one of the most important things for the public to realize is that there really is no scientific debate about the fundamentals of climate change. The scientific debate on that was over about 20 years ago, and ever since, the consensus on this has been extremely strong, and all the noise in the media is basically just that. It is noise, not a scientific debate. And so we know enough to act, and I think once people realize that we know enough and that it's in our interest to act, then we'll move forward.
Professor Stefan Lewandowsky, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Nominations are now open for the 2017 Australian Farmer of the Year Awards.
Celebrating innovation, diversity and success, we're looking for the industry's best.
Nominate yourself or someone you know for the title of Farmer of the Year, Young Farmer of the Year or Farming Legend of the Year.
Find the details at abc.net.au/rural.
The Australian Farmer of the Year Awards.
Proudly supported by the